Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS Webcast, Family Matters, Practical Malware Family Identification for Incident Responders, sponsored by VMRay. My name is Carol Auth of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Jake Williams and Tamas Boczan. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to
Hey, thanks so much, Carol. Really appreciate it, and I'm super excited to be here with SANS and VMRay to discuss one of my passions here, malware, and definitely among the as malware goes, this family identification is something we don't talk a lot about. Before we get started here, or as we get started, I'd really like to give a shout out to VMRay. They have done an amazing amount of work with SANS on really a lot of thought leadership pieces. They are the only company that I'm aware of that's involved in the malware sandboxing game that dares even talk about the fact that malware attempts to bypass sandboxes, let alone ran an entire webcast where they're like, yeah, they came, I almost thought it was a troll when they're like, hey, we want to talk about how malware bypasses sandboxes. I'm like, excuse me, what? All right, and they're like, no, definitely. And done a lot of these together. Again, this is just another one of these that there's just not content out there about. Identifying families, as well as getting into how we do it, why it's important, etc. So again, just a huge shout out here. I'm super excited to be here with Tamas again and working with VMRay. So as we get into the agenda, right? What are malware families in the first place? Why does malware family identification matter, right? I suspect that there's a non-zero number of you live, as well as some I suspect that are going to watch this on the recording. They'll be like, I'm sorry, family what? Or family identification, right? I think we're all tracking that there are malware families out there, right? But again, why does identification matter? How do we use that tactically, not academically, but tactically to make a difference in our incident response, as well as just in general, understanding our greater threat picture. We're going to walk you through a few case studies to really drive that home. And then I'll kind of close that out a little bit and kick it over to VMRay, and they have some outstanding content around this as well. Again, I'm super stoked about this. So what are malware families, right? Obviously, there are millions of different malware samples, but it turns out that some of those samples can be grouped into families. And we talk about a family, it's more than just malware that shares a common lineage or development group. We talk about a malware family, we're talking about samples that share the majority of their code with another sample. We see dev overlap all the time. And when I say dev, I mean development overlap, some code sharing. Surprisingly, well, I said surprisingly, it's not surprising when you think about it, but there's an amazing amount of code reuse with Stack Overflow in malware, right? We wouldn't call that a family necessarily. We wouldn't call the malware Stack Overflow family or whatever. Again, we also see times when a sample shares 100% of its code with another sample. It only differs in the configuration, right? So picture here that you've got some malware that only changes, let's say, the callback domain. And when we talk about that, folks often justifiably ask, like, well, why, right? How does that play, right? Well, it turns out that the malware authors, or excuse me, malware operators, are using a tool called a builder. Right? And a builder is basically a tool that allows basically an operator, not necessarily a developer, right? Picture if you wanted to go change the callback domain and you wanted to go change the maybe a mutex that's being used by a piece of malware, or the process name that it's going to run under, or some other piece of information, some other piece of data in the malware. Normally you'd have to go recompile it, right? Now, from a criminal underground standpoint, this does not make sense. This is not something you want to do. The malware author does not want to give up the source code so that folks out there that are buying, for instance, this malware but need to dynamically reconfigure it, they don't want to be the single point of failure. One, because they don't want to have to do all that work recompiling every time. They also don't want to give away the source code. And so what they do typically is they'll create a separate program called a builder, and that builder itself churns out the actual malware that you see on your machine. The builder is not going to be deployed into your environment. The builder is something that stays back, basically stays back with the criminal operator or the nation state operator for that matter. And if you picture just a GUI tool that allows you to go fill in a couple of, basically fill in a couple of values, process name is a very common one. What process are we going to inject into if we don't run as a process itself? But I'll say that a builder is not necessary to declare a malware family, but certainly any malware with a builder meets the family definition, right? Because what's happening here is you're churning out sample after sample after sample with the same core code, just different configurations, right? So as we get into talking about builders and how do you know you're even investigating a family, right? Because remember, the builder's not getting deployed to you. The thing that's getting deployed to you is the output of the builder, right? So if you do enough malware analysis like Tamas, obviously you're going to have a sense of deja vu, right? I do a good bit of malware analysis, not as much as I used to, because my time's split between that and incident response and a couple of other things. But you know, Tamas, full-time malware researcher, and certainly when I was full-time as well, I get this sense of deja vu. You can still see it today, where I'm like, oh man, I've been here before. I know what this is. I've seen this before. Now, the reality is, if you're not Tamas, right, or you just don't do this every day, right, tools with classification signatures can help us understand that we're investigating a family. One of the cheap/free-ish ways to get into this is to download Yara and get into some rule sharing groups. Now, of course, you have to understand, of course, in a rule sharing group that, you know, if you have folks that are cranking out bad rules, meaning rules that are suboptimal, you know, obviously you're going to have a bad time, right? That's just, you know, the classifications can't be any better than the rules. And then you have a lot of commercial companies that crank out a lot of family identification work as well. But, you know, this is a spot where, I mean, I've got a lot of my own opinions here, but I'd love to kick it over to Tamas and ask, you know, how do you typically identify that, you know, you're working on a malware sample and you're like, hey, is this part of a family? How do you identify that, Tamas?
Right, so I usually execute it in our sandbox. And as you say, because I do this every day, I see the same kind of samples every day. So because even though the sample statically is very different, the behavior is still almost the same for the same family. So if I see the same sandbox report every day, then I know that it's a family.
Yeah, I got it. That totally makes sense, right? So when you say statically, just for the folks in the audience that don't do a lot of malware reversing, right? And I'll kick this back over you if you want to elaborate on this. But when we say statically, what we're talking about here is you look in a disassembler, right? And or use you know, blockwise or fuzzy hashing, and again, the sample looks very, very different at the assembly level. Looks very, very different at the machine code level, but the behavior at runtime is virtually identical if you look at your execution traces, right? Tamas, did you want to clarify anything more about like the static versus dynamic?
Yeah, exactly what I meant. So disassembling or looking at static features like its imports, these depend on the packer that the malware author used to obfuscate, but the behavior of the payload itself, it will be very similar.
Yeah, that's totally it. And you know, the analogy that I've used with this, and by the way, any of the attendees here, feel free to steal the analogies here if you need these to work with maybe less technical folks. But you know, one of the things that I always explain, you know, everybody loves a good SEAL Team 6 or a Delta Force movie, right? And we all know that they're always in camouflage, right? You know, but they use different kinds of camouflage for different environments, and sure enough, even though they look very differently, look very different in an urban or desert or woodland setting, they still execute the same way. They still have the same, basically the same runtime execution as they go and execute their mission, right? So that's kind of the camouflage, as it were, is the static. The actual mission execution is the runtime analysis, right? So as we get into, you know, a little bit past why does family ID matter in the first place, right? And folks have asked me this, you know, we're like, oh yeah, hey, this looks like Emotet, or it looks like PlugX, or it looks like, you know, and they say, well, does that matter? And the answer is, yeah, absolutely, right? I need every leg up that I can get on an attacker when we're working an incident. And the reality is that malware is just a tool used by the attacker. A lot of folks want to over focus on the malware, and I tell you, as a seasoned incident responder, this is a mistake. You don't want to only focus on the malware as part of the broader incident. Now, we talk about sandboxing, rock on, that's exactly what we're doing. It's entirely malware focused. In the broader context of the incident, I need to understand more about what the attacker is doing with the malware. And if I understand that we have a family, I can start to break down some of the TTPs, right? So the techniques, the tradecraft, et cetera, that the attackers are using, or the actors, threat actors that use this malware have been used previously. And so when builders haven't been leaked in the public domain, family identification can assist in attribution as well. I mentioned that these builders sometimes are used by nation state operators, but sometimes also used by cyber criminals. Man, if I've got one that's not for sale, if I'm now convinced where it's like looking and saying, oh man, this is clearly a nation state piece of malware. I've seen dozens of samples. It looks like there's a builder back there, someplace we haven't seen the builder yet. This can help me identify, attribution as well. And then with ransomware, family identification helps me evaluate the likelihood that paying is going to get decryption keys released. Now, I'm not going to get into the debate about whether or not paying is appropriate. At the end of the day, some businesses need to do it to get back on their feet. And a question that we always get is, how do we know that when we pay, we're going to get keys? And the short answer is, you don't, right? But if I can identify the family and I can identify the reputation of that group, right, that's going to help me a lot. Now, if I have ransomware that's written by the groups employing it, that's great. I have 100%, I say that the malware itself is then tied to the actual folks operating on the back end. In other cases, it's not. We'll talk more about that in one of our case studies. That can be a truly challenging kind of piece there. But again, that family identification helps us make that assessment and communicate that clearly, and assess our risk of not getting the keys or getting the keys as we pay. And so as we talk about techniques for family identification, right? Malware family members, again, we talked about, share significant amounts of code between their variants. And discovering these families and grouping the family members usually is going to rely on matching binary patterns from existing malware. Why don't you want to just rely on strings? I mean, you could, right? I'm going to kick this to Tamas in a second here. You could rely on strings, but it's way too easy to create false flag attacks with strings. We've actually seen that employed. The binary patterns themselves tend to belie, and the runtime traces tend to belie a little bit more. They're a little bit harder to change when it comes down to it for the threat actor, and so we don't see see as much of the attempt around false flagging there. Of course, you can try to use complex Yara rules. Of course, Yara is just a tool, and the signatures, right? Those have to be developed by those reverse engineers who are doing pattern analysis. And I want to kick over to Tamas here. A lot of organizations that I work with today, they don't have reverse engineers on staff. I mean, they may have somebody like they can phone a friend or something, but how can they expect to identify new malware families themselves, or is that even something that's realistic?
Right, so identifying an existing malware family, they can do with some kind of tool, like you mentioned. They can do it with Yara, they can do it with a Sandbox or some other third-party tool like ID Ransomware is a good tool. But if they have an entirely new malware family, then likely they need some reverse engineer to work with them. But that is very rare though. So the chances that they are targeted by an entirely new malware family that's never been seen before, that's very low. Attackers like to reuse their existing tooling.
And sure, that makes sense when we think about it, right? The odds that you are the first to be hit by this new thing, right? It's a fairly low, kind of piece here. And I actually want to pivot back to something you and I were talking about earlier with the static versus the sandbox, the behavioral analysis, right? Because here we're talking about, like, you can build some complex Yara rules and you can try to match binary patterns, and but the reality is, as you pointed out earlier, Tamas, right? We have a lot of change or a lot of churn in the basically the high level look at the malware, the static, basically the static analysis side, and so that tends to break the Yara rules. Whereas, because Yara is literally looking at the file on the disk, right? So basically the static analysis of the binary, but at the runtime, at the behavioral level, that's something that is much more difficult to obfuscate, and so you still see the same runtime traces there. Do you want to speak at all to, like, how using a sandbox that has that family identification built in can be, really a game changer for an organization?
Oh, absolutely. So a sandbox will actually execute the sample, run the sample's own unpacker, and then have access to the unpacked code and run signatures after that. So we will, in our section of this webcast, we will talk about all the techniques that a sandbox uses to identify families, and having access to the unpacked code and the behavior is really useful for it. And from a user's point of view, the sandbox might just give them the family classification that they need. They don't really need to care about reverse engineering or binary patterns or anything like that.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so what we're talking about here then effectively is force multiplication, right? So we're taking somebody that doesn't do reverse engineering. Even if you do reverse engineering, I mean, look, even if you have the skills, maybe it's not your best use of time here. Absolutely love this. And to kind of clarify, when we talk about packing and packed code, again, what we're talking about here effectively is a way to obfuscate the code at basically the code that's loaded on or saved to disk, but ultimately, once that code is loaded into memory, it's deobfuscated, it's unpacked, and then you can see the underlying patterns. And the way that I usually analogize this is if you picture somebody that has a very distinctive tattoo, let's say on their chest, for instance, they can cover that up with any number of different shirts. Each one of those looks different. So identifying that that's the guy in the tattoo, would require you to identify all of the shirts in his wardrobe. If on the other hand, right, you are able to instruct him to take off that shirt, you can immediately still see the underlying tattoo. And that's what that sandbox effectively is doing. It's basically saying, no, take off the shirt, brother. And then we're going to look at what's under the shirt, right? What's unpacked into memory and do pattern analysis there. And that's something that, again, absent a sandbox, you really are missing that ability to do that at scale, right? Reverse engineers obviously can do this one-off. So I want to talk quickly about a couple of case studies here. This one is a classic. It is certainly, excuse me, it is certainly one that we have seen more than I care to admit. But PlugX, when it first emerged, it was almost exclusively seen being used by Chinese nation state or state hackers. PlugX builders have leaked into the public domain now. And different actors use it. Some of them, I'm sure, are doing it for cyber false flag operations. Fun fact: found PlugX running on a couple of servers while we're responding to an incident that didn't have PlugX as one of the TTPs. This is about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, something like that. And we're like, oh snap, there's a second actor in the network, or for some reason they deployed different malware here. And it turns out, no, not at all. It was actually the systems administrator had downloaded, like he couldn't get his firm to license, a remote administration tool like Dameware or whatever. And so he downloaded a PlugX builder and was running malware on his servers to do remote administration, which was just mind blowing to me, but rock on. But when it comes down to it, different versions of PlugX can be built with different embedded modules. These determine the available functionality here, right? So if we can determine the version of the builder that was used, that can inform us about the available modules. And again, that can help us remove, if we know we only care about a particular capability and it's not available in that version of the malware, that can really help us out very quickly to say, if our only concern is did X happen, and we say it couldn't have because not with this malware anyway, because it's missing this capability, game on, and we can rock it from there. I want to talk about Emotet, right? So Emotet is usually thought of as a banking Trojan, but it shows up consistently as an infection vector for other malware, including ransomware. And I'll tell you, banking Trojans like Emotet are usually more concerning to home users than enterprises. Right now, look, we all have heard the stories about some comptroller being targeted, and the comptroller gets targeted, and all of a sudden there's a big ACH transfer, or they mess with payroll or whatever. That's typically not Emotet, right? So Emotet is typically more of a target home user logging onto their banking, basically their bank website, and do small scale, and I don't mean small scale like globally, but small scale individually fraud. And so as we get into Emotet, though, what we've seen a lot in the past is we think that whoever's operating the Emotet botnet, or Emotet botnets, I guess is a better way to put it there, will sell access selectively to other actors, sell, trade, something to other actors who are using, basically are deploying more advanced malware. And typically, we believe this happens in domain environments. They land in a domain and they're like, oh yeah, well, I mean, maybe we get something out of this, but we get way more out of this. This other group we work with, they'll pay us more than our average return from one of these installations, right? And so, I want to kick this over to Tamas because I know we're seeing a lot of this. We've seen Emotet used to deploy other more advanced malware in a ridiculous number of cases. What do you recommend as a course of action, right? If you see an organization that identifies an Emotet infection, what do you typically what would you tell them to do?
Yeah, it's not an easy question. So getting rid of Emotet is not really easy. So getting rid of it on a single host, that's easy. But getting rid of all the consequences of an Emotet infection, that's difficult. So it's easy to identify relatively because it's always using the same run keys. So it's using the same persistence methods, and it's sending out network beacons. But it's also doing lateral movement. So it's moving on the network and infecting other hosts. It's stealing all of the emails that are present on a host, and then it starts to reply. The botnet starts to reply to email threads and infecting other people. And it's also able to download secondary payloads, as you mentioned. And the secondary payloads can also do lateral movement. So I guess first the victim organization would have to identify all of the hosts that are infected by Emotet, get rid of Emotet, and then also get rid of the secondary payloads the same way. They would need to identify what the secondary payload was and clean all of the hosts that are infected, and then somehow even mitigate the issues that come from the compromised data.
Yeah, definitely. And on that end, I think Tamas brings up several good points. There's one, clarification I'd like to make there, or just I say clarification, but kind of amplify a point. Tamas said, yeah, it's easy to identify Emotet because it always uses the same set of run keys, and it has a very distinctive beaconing pattern and all that. I want to clarify here that when Tamas says Emotet is super easy to identify, he means in a runtime, I'll let you confirm this, but I think you mean
absolutely.
Sandbox environment, right?
Yes, yes, statically identifying it is difficult. So
definitely.
It has a pretty advanced packer.
Yeah, and that's the point, right? Because I want to clarify for the audience here. Emotet is changing the packer. We've seen a couple of times where we've seen like 3 or 4 different Emotet packers used in the same 24-hour period, right? And the reason you see the attackers doing this, and it's only slight tweaks that they need to do, or they need to make to these packers to generate samples that statically look so different that our antivirus is not able to keep up, right? And our email scanners, et cetera, are not able to keep up. And so once you understand it and can detonate one of these samples in your sandbox, and you understand to a greater or lesser extent, what secondary payloads is this particular operator using in this environment, that is a huge benefit for you. Now, of course, obviously they can task other secondary payloads after it's detonated. But again, any piece of information you can get to level the playing field is just wow. And again, I'll just throw out there that this is wicked difficult to detect. If you hand me a sample and you're like, is this Emotet? And my only tools that I have in front of me are static disassemblers, I'm going to struggle on that, right? That's going to be a tough thing for me to do. Whereas once I get into a sandbox, or for that matter, dynamic analysis, if I can throw it into a debugger, I can do that. Unfortunately, the debugger doesn't scale and it requires advanced skills, right? All things equal, I'd much rather detonate it in a sandbox. Emotet is one of those too, by the way, that does some sandbox evasion, right? And again, I kind of kicked around earlier that we've seen variants of it that do sandbox evasion, and I kicked around earlier that I'm really proud of VMRay with the thought leadership piece here, because again, the ability to or the willingness to discuss how malware is targeting sandboxes when that is what you do is just tremendous. And obviously, if they're talking about it, they obviously understand how to basically the counter detection, right, as it were. So again, awesome work there. And then finally, we'll talk quickly about Dharma, right? Dharma ransomware was one of the first widespread strains that I would describe as ransomware as a service. I mean, there were a couple of other ones, I guess, Gand Crab was another big one there. Certainly. But look, here, operators didn't really need to build their ransomware anymore. They simply bought access to existing ransomware. And this is where the stuff gets kind of scary, right, when it comes down to it, because suddenly we have less, and I say scary, not from a, oh my gosh, the sky is falling, but for incident responders, right, like myself, we get into a situation where a client turns to us and says, should I pay, right? And we're like, ugh. The reality is that with Dharma, it was a super hard thing to know. Now, this obviously was critical for us to identify the strain or identify the family to be able to make this determination and give them advice. But with a lot of earlier ransomware, we could look and say, hey, here's your chance, here's your percentage chance based on our experience and the experience of, a couple of folks that we share and trade intelligence with around this. With Dharma, it became super difficult, right? Because with Dharma, my big problem that I run into is literally any Yahoo can go out and buy a copy of this, right? And when any Yahoo can go buy a copy of this ransomware and then they operate that independently, I have a hard time knowing, basically the key getting returned depends on two things, right? And proper decryption depends on two things. One, that the ransomware operates correctly, and the decryptor too operates correctly, right? That's the first piece. And then second, you're sending a lot of cryptocurrency back to an attacker with literally no guarantee. And so the reputation piece becomes super important. And Dharma, we're able to go level set and say, look, either as opposed to simply looking at the malware, then we really need to break that down further and start looking at the group. Right. So again, it breaks that model of understanding the reputation of the ransomware operator based on the family. Now, again, there are other ransomware as a service, strains or families, if you will. But this happens to be one of the, one of the bigger ones and really one of the OGs. I guess you might throw in there again, GandCrab certainly was another, another kind of OG of ransomware as a service. But I'll kick back to Tamas here. Tamas, anything to add here around ransomware family identification?
Yeah, we'll talk a lot more about it soon, but yeah, it's one of the most important family identifications, because with the ransomware, if you can identify the family, then that really helps you proceed.
Yeah, definitely agree. Definitely agree. So I'm going to go ahead and close out here my section of this and kick it over to VMRay, and I'm crazy excited for their content as well. But look, family idea malware, just a couple closing thoughts. It gives practitioners a more complete picture of the incident. Remember, malware is a tool. Again, another example, another analogy that I use here, a lot of folks want to over-focus on malware. A lot of executives like to over-focus on what is the malware? What does it do? I'm like, the threat actor does stuff the malware doesn't, right? And when we talk about this, I always talk about going to Home Depot and picking up a hammer, right? A hammer in my hands, I can swing it and I can break stuff, right? But in a carpenter's hands, it becomes a completely different tool, even though physically the tool hasn't changed. It's what can they do with it? Us understanding the TTPs of the actor based on the family identification is tremendous, right? If attribution matters to you, rock on, great. It can aid in attribution too, right? Most often this isn't the bigger concern, but again, the TTPs give you that leg up, certainly from network threat hunting teams, and it enables you to employ appropriate defenses so much faster. So look, with this, I want to kick this over to Tamas to present the VMRay side of this. I'm crazy excited about this. Tamas, take it away, man.
Thank you. So in our portion of the webcast, we will talk about how Sandbox can aid family identification. So once you have the sample and you don't want to statically analyze it, how you can use it with a Sandbox, how Sandbox can help you identify the family. Okay. So the first idea is to not use a Sandbox, just upload the sample to VirusTotal and see what static antiviruses say and try to skip dynamic analysis. This is and this usually for new samples it doesn't work for the same reasons that Jake already mentioned. From a static point of view, just the file itself, the disassembly, the imports, these malware families look very different. And AVs also struggle with this. If an antivirus has to identify it statically, then it will have to do a little bit of emulation and extract a lot of data and use a lot of statistics to establish heuristics. And these heuristics should define whether the sample is malicious or not. And the goal of these heuristics is not really to define its family. The goal is just to label it as malicious or not. and to do this with an acceptable precision. And it's also based on this very little set of data that is static. It's very difficult to identify the family. So this is where dynamic analysis comes in, either a debugger, so a reverse engineer manually executing the sample in a debugger and extracting the payload, and then running signatures on them like Yara. And this is very efficient. Now Yara, or the signature engine, actually has the data that it needs to make a correct decision. However, doing this in an automated way, that's not simple at all. That's why a sandbox can be very useful for this, and it's even, I would consider it necessary for unpacking, because it simplifies the process so much, and it makes it an automated process from a manual process. And in this example, these are screenshots from a VMRay report. And the VMRay report shows that we identified Emotet based on the memory dumps and identified which modules this specific Emotet sample was using. The Emotet MAPI module is using the Office API to extract emails from Office. However, this memory dumping assumes that the code or the interesting strings or binary patterns are on the heap, and that is not always the case. There's a lot of interesting strings which only appear on the stack, mostly as parameters of API calls. And sandboxes can also help to various degree with extracting these strings, and running Yara on them can be very good because this reveals some internal function that would otherwise not be visible. So the degree to how much this is useful depends a lot on the sandboxing technology. There are multiple technologies that a sandbox can use to monitor API calls. And almost all commercial sandboxes are based on API hooking and based on an open source project named Cuckoo. So what API hooking does is that it defines a relatively small set of API functions and monitors only these API calls. And whenever one of these API calls is hooked, the data is logged. And when different API calls are called, then there is no logging, but execution of those API calls is much, much faster. So this method has a big overhead on every single monitored function call, which is why they try to pick and choose which API calls to monitor and which ones to not monitor. And what they pick to monitor is what is generating IOCs or some network data. And what they lose is some string operations or some internal parsing that is for signatures. It's interesting because it reveals the malware's internal behavior. And the case with emulator-based sandboxes is very simple. They are just very slow, and they can't properly monitor everything. VMRay has a hypervisor-based approach, so the internals of the operating system are not modified at all. VMRay is implemented in the hypervisor, and the advantage of this technology is that we have a very granular look of what the sample is, what API calls the sample is calling. So we don't get an API call that was hooked, and was called by something that the sample called, but we get the API call that was directly called by the sample. And even API calls which don't generate IOCs, they are very useful for this. For example, in this screenshot, this is ursnif's behavior, and ursnif is parsing its internal configuration. So these API calls might seem irrelevant because they are just getting the length of a string, but here the string that is used is the encryption key used for decrypting the data sent to the C2. And the next string is actually all of the URLs that the sample is able to contact, all of the C2 URLs. Our next, on this slide, we're seeing a signature on function strings. So for this specific sample, it was pegged by a packer where it's challenging to make memory dumps, and the memory dumps don't contain the entire malware. And writing signatures like Yara based on the memory dump would be difficult. But the necessary strings still appear in API calls as parameters, and that's how we detected it. This feature is also useful for network traffic. This is, again, a screenshot of a VMRay report for URSNIF. Here, URSNIF contacted its C2 via this URL. And this URL is very often used by URSNIF, not this exact URL, but this pattern of having images along encrypted string and then ending with a common extension like JPEG or GIF or BMP or AVI. So to the naked eye, we can probably tell this is URSNIF, but we can't properly write a signature for this. This would FP all the time. Because an URL such as this appears in normal web traffic all the time. So what we can do is get the version of this beacon before the encryption and the obfuscation happened. And if we look inside our function log, our API log, we see the format string that was used to create this URL before it was obfuscated. And this format string resembles the family very well. And in the case of URSNIF, this one also resembles the specific URSNIF variant very well. Another technique that we use is running signatures on dropped files or modified files. This is especially useful with ransomware because all ransomware basically does two things. They encrypt files and they drop a ransom note to tell the victim how to get their files back. And traditionally, it was common to write signatures for the ransom note because often the family's name and was even included in the ransom note, or some very family-specific ransom notes were created. But more recently, this is less common, and the ransom notes are defined by the attacker differently for each sample, or the attacker has a ransom note that they use with different ransomware as a service malware, so different services. So this ransom note is now less useful for identifying the family than it was like a year ago. What is still very useful is identifying based on the markers that are present in the encrypted files. So we can submit a ransomware sample to a sandbox, see how the encrypted files look, and we will often find markers in them that identify the family. These the malware puts there because if the attacker wants to give the user their files back because they paid the ransom, then they have to have a way to identify the files which were encrypted by the ransomware. And they also need to have a way to restore the original file, so they often store metadata in the file itself, and also a marker that signals that this encrypted file was created by the ransomware. And online tool created for ransomware victims is also very useful for this. It does basically the same thing that I said. So the victim can upload the ransom note and upload an encrypted file, and this online service will look through their database, run signatures on it, and give the user the information which family the malware belongs to, and whether there is a free decryptor for the malware or not. Another common way to identify families is based on IOCs. So on this example, we see a TrickBot infection. This is another screenshot from a VMRay report, where we see the dropped files created by TrickBot. And we see that it, as TrickBot usually does, it created its modules under the app data directory. And this is where TrickBot stores some encrypted modules and their configurations. So, and these file names are constant. So if we find files with these names under the app data directory, then we will see that there was a TrickBot infection. And from this sandbox report, we can even see what modules this specific TrickBot sample installs. Like the password grabbing module gets cached passwords from applications like web browsers, and the network module enumerates the network, and some other modules, the last three on this slide, are used for moving laterally within the network. And the last type of family identification technique that we'd like to talk about is behavior-based detections. These are a very powerful detection technique because it can identify generic behaviors. So even if we don't, even if the sample is completely new, it's a completely new family, based on behavior, we can identify that the malicious behavior was created. And by digging deeper into what type of malicious behavior it is, like what processes were injected, or if the malware is stealing cached passwords from 67 applications, then, and some of these 67 are unique to this malware family, then those can also be used to identify a family reliably. And in conclusion, we think that there are three main reasons why somebody would want to classify malware samples into families. The first one is to speed up the analysis. So if an analyst needs to quickly find out information about a single sample, then if a sandbox provides them with a family, then they basically know all about it. And from there, the analysis gets very quick. The second reason we think it's important is that it provides a deep understanding of the threat. So if an analyst wants to deep dive, wants to reverse engineer it, then starting with the family, that's a very good starting point, because from there they can proceed easily. And VMRay helps a lot with this by first by providing the family or some identifiers that the analyst can use to find the family for themselves easily. And then also this very detailed function log and the memory dumps help with in-depth reverse engineering or config extraction, or any way that the analyst would want to proceed. And what we think the most useful use cases is getting a wide understanding of the threat landscape. So understanding what type of malware families an organization or any organization on the world is targeted with. And that would help defenders to create a better defense against the threats, now that they know what kind of threats exist. And that is our portion of the presentation. Thank you.
All right, thanks for that great presentation. We have some questions ready for the Q&A. However, anyone has a question for our presenters, please enter it into the questions window now. Tamas, I'm guessing you want to take a look and handle the questions, correct?
Okay. Yeah, I'll look at the questions and answer them. Yeah, I'll just read them in order. So what's the easiest way to get the commands issued by malware on the command line when processing malware analysis? It seems that the sandboxes I looked at don't record commands issued by the malware. For example, ARP. Well, it should be a basic function of any sandbox to record these commands which were used by CMD. So if the command was, you know that the command should be executed and the sandbox somehow didn't log it, that seems to be a classic case of sandbox evasion. So before executing the command, probably the sample did some kind of evasion, or it was just very slow, and the analysis didn't get there in time. So you might want to submit the same sample for a longer timeout to see if that solves it, or you may want to try another sandbox that is better at evasion resistance. Second one is, are there any public resources for, Are there any public resources for tracking dynamic patterns, IOCs, to get better at recognizing different families? So there are many IOC feeds which have different quality. And some of them are free, but of course not the best ones. And so you could try looking into IOC feeds. They have, some of them are better than others, but I think all of them need some kind of filtering before you can use them.
Hey, Tamas, can we kind of clarify that a little bit too? Because this is a question that I get, again and again and again. Like, why do I have to pay for my IOCs? Well, why aren't people just providing them for free? And I think to your point, there are some free ones. You mentioned the best ones are private, and then also that again, that any of the free feeds you end up having to do some vetting on. Do you want to clarify that a little bit for the audience? Because this is a question that comes up again and again.
Yeah, so it's difficult to identify anything based on IOCs, I think, because they just change so quickly. And also, it's similar to anything that's free. So if it's free, then it sometimes has worse quality than if it's paid.
Yeah, I think. Oh, good.
Yeah, the people that are creating the IOC feed don't work for free.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's probably the one of the biggest pieces for me, right? Is that when I'm doing a paid feed, I know that I've got somebody like you, right? And I say feed, right? Obviously, what the work you're doing gets rolled right into that, right into that sandbox, your hypervisor-based sandbox that you're using. That work obviously gets rolled in there. VMRay pays your salary, and you have a full-time job doing that, right? Even folks that are prolific and contributing stuff to the community, they can't contribute everything they do back to the community because of non-disclosure agreements, you name it, and then just time, right? But separately, I think there's another big piece here that a lot of folks miss, and that's that anything that's free and unvetted, again, you mentioned false positives during your piece of the presentation. That's definitely something that I encounter. But another big one that we don't talk a lot about in our community is counterintelligence, right? For an attacker to use and get counterintelligence, meaning what do defenders know about me? For them to get it from everywhere, they end up having to buy access to a lot of different feeds. But man, they can monitor the free feeds the same as anybody else, right? And so we typically, I'm going to tell you that even at my company, we've got IOCs and and even runtime signatures that we don't share with the broader community, because we know that the second that we share that out to wide open community space, the attackers are going to get access to that too, and then change it, right? Sometimes, for instance, we'll be looking at something, and Tamas, I'd be interested to know if you've ever had this experience, but I'll see on one of the free feeds that we monitor, I'll see an IOC that we've been tracking for months, and I just get this sinking feeling in my gut where I'm like, man, now I'm going to have because I know I've got like hours to days before the attackers adapt and change it, and that means that now I've got to go hunt for that next, like, how am I going to detect this attacker again, right? Is that something you've experienced as well?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So whatever we publish, attackers read it too.
Yeah, definitely.
I got a very similar question. Is there any database for binary patterns? So yes, there are. So I think mostly there are free Yara rule sets, and there is a lot of them, and they also have different quality. But I found that the free Yara rule sets are often better than the free IOC feeds. So just searching on GitHub for Yara rule sets will probably give you either one of the big Yara rule sets that are uploaded to GitHub, or it will one of the first two search results will be and list for Yara collection of Yara repositories that are all unvetted, but some of the rules on there are great and some of them are useless.
No, definitely a lot of them are useless. No question there, right? So yeah.
Yeah. So there are more questions. I'm just reading them.
Okay. So hey, while you're queuing up that next question, I wanted to hop back to the hypervisor technology piece as you kind of go find that next question there. As somebody that teaches reverse engineering and has goodness with the SANS Institute and elsewhere for, gosh, now it's been more than a decade I've been teaching reverse engineering. I can tell you how significant the hypervisor sandbox approach is versus the basically versus the API hooking approach. The API hooks, nobody hooks string functions. You just don't do it, right? Because string functions get called all the time, right? And if you weren't tracking what Tamas was talking about when we say heap and stack, if it helps, and I'm going to make a broad overgeneralization here, and I'm sure there's going to be somebody that's going to like hammer me on Twitter, about generalization of the reverse engineering, but think about the heap like global memory, right? And that's what a lot of our memory, basically global memory for the entire program lives throughout the execution of the program. And that's what when Tamas was talking about doing sandboxes that use memory dumps and basically unpack into memory and then say, well, let me just search for signatures in memory. It's a useful technique, but it's often bypassed through a super easy trick. And sometimes the attacker's not even trying to trick us, that just as an artifact of the way they've programmed, they're decoding stuff directly on the stack. And if it helps to think about the stack as a post-it note versus your file folder, right? So the stack is a temporary storage location. And unless you're running a hypervisor, basically a hypervisor sandbox, you're not going to see all the stuff going on the stack, right? So when Tamas talked about being able to pull that, basically pull that key for TrickBot to be able to decode the command and control and see what was see the encryption key being used there, that's something that you're not going to see in the majority of sandboxes because two reasons. One, that string sits on the stack, right, effectively, and so as they decode that, basically it's there on the stack. You don't have folks that are, that are hooking these string functions in API hooking sandboxes because string functions get called orders of magnitude more than a lot of other APIs, and it just makes stuff too slow, and again, can be bypassed anyway, right? So again, super significant. Just wanted to kind of clarify that point as, basically as Tamas is queuing up the next question. But again, if we think about analogy, the majority of the folks that are scanning memory dumps are basically opening that file cabinet and they're looking for all of the permanent storage that's in the filing cabinet, and they're missing all the post-it notes that are sitting up on the monitor there, right? So anyway, I'll kick it back to Tamas there for the basically to hit up that next question.
All right, so there was a follow-up question on how would you suggest filtering free IOC feeds? And well, there's no real good way to filter it automatically, I think. So if it needs to be somewhat manual process at least. So at least the heuristics need to be compiled manually based on your data and the feed's data, and comparing and seeing what false positives are generated. Or Jake, what do you think?
I think that's a great handling of the question, and I got to tell you, I groaned a little bit when I was like, oh man, that's going to be a hard one to answer. I think you did a great job there answering. I don't have a good solution for for filtering and vetting an IOC feed other than to have a lot of malware, right? The problem is, with filtering and vetting one of these IOC feeds, right? You have the free IOC feeds. I have a reasonable assertion with a paid IOC feed that my vendor is, whoever that is understanding, the false positive rate, right? We obviously have false positive and false negative rates. I care to different degrees about each, right? A false negative meaning that something was a thing, malware, what have you, and we missed it. We didn't call it malware. The false positive is it's not malware and we called it malware, or it is not this family and we called it a particular family. As we talk about those, obviously there's some tuning that plays in there, and I expect on the paid side, the paid feed side, I expect that my vendor, as part of them distributing a rule, that they've adjusted that balance for me. And also, for that matter, different vendors have different balances of false positive versus true positive, but I know what to expect. There's consistency there. Most of our free feeds are community contributed, and so we have a large number of authors with very lackadaisical quality control, right? And so if any quality control for that matter, quality control is generally left up to the submitter, not to the rule distribution, right? And so how do you vet those? I mean, the short of it is, if you have known malware, so for instance, if I get a rule that says this detects TrickBot, if I have a sample of TrickBot in my possession, I can run that Yara rule or that IOC, set. I can run that against, TrickBot, whether that's the static file, a memory dump, etc., and say, did it detect TrickBot? If yes, okay, I know that the rule works in at least some cases. If I don't have samples, it becomes exponentially more difficult. And then secondarily, if it hits on another file, right? If I get a rule that hits on a file like, hey, it's TrickBot, right? I now have to really ask, like, is that really TrickBot, or is it a false positive from the rules? So the short of it is, without having a lot of malware, and by the way, it's not sufficient just to go out and be like, I'm going to go download gigabytes of malware on file sharing, whatever, because it's not labeled, right? That's the big problem. You need labeled data sets, right, to be able to really vet these. And once you have those labeled data sets, you can start to vet some of those rules. This is something that I think is very easy for a lot of commercial companies. But again, if you're sitting there, you're the one person shop or 2-person shop, whatever, in a larger organization even, I think it's pretty difficult. To Tamas, is that kind of along the lines of what you think as well?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's, for any kind of filtering, you first need a big labeled data set that is correct, and then you can start filtering anything.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. I think we may have time for one last question. That's also a difficult one. It's, what name standard should I use for malware family naming? I know each vendor has its own convention. So I think it seems that the family naming is very different if you just look at VirusTotal results, but they are not actually different. So if you just upload a packed TrickBot sample to VirusTotal, you will get 100 detection names, and they might be different because they don't really describe the family. They will describe the heuristic that they use to detect the packer. So some would call it heuristic agent malicious, but that's not really a malware family name. That's just a label for the antivirus's heuristic for detecting that type of packer. But if you look at publications made by or blog posts, papers made by the same antivirus or any kind of security company, you will see that they all call it TrickBot. So the names are not really different that much between vendors as you might think based on some static analysis data. So I'd suggest if you're picking a family name, you look at blog posts or papers or presentations and not on detections made by the engine.
Yeah. I mean, just just to expand on that or compound that a little bit, I 100% agree with what Tamas is saying. It often looks more confusing than it is, but it's because of the heuristic used to detect. And I'm going to go back to my delta force and camouflage again, right? The signatures you're seeing on VirusTotal are literally basically the heuristic used to detect, right? So you might look and say, oh, that's tiger stripe camouflage, but everybody wearing tiger stripe camouflage gets labeled there, when in fact, if I'm wearing it, I am clearly not delta force, but the guy under the hood really is. You want to go grab that family ID, the underlying piece, and that's something that you're not going to see most often with static analysis. And one of the reasons that you're not seeing those the actual family names being published in the basically the VirusTotal sets there is that without detonating, without executing, and without access to that with the antivirus engine and the heuristic engine, they can't actually make a family identification. And that's probably one of the best points to close on here, is that without a detonating sandbox, and preferably one that runs at the hypervisor level, again, that's something that you're not going to be able to do accurately and consistently.
Okay, I think that was the last of the questions that we have time for.
All right, well, thank you so much, Jake and Tamas, for your great presentation, and to VMRay for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcast. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.